Do you think we should wait a minute or so before I start, or should I just go ahead and dive in?
I would just dive in. There's quite a few people here that have popped over from the other meeting.
Sure. Okay, well, hi, I'm Elizabeth Albright, Dr. Albright from Langston University, which is in Oklahoma in the United States. So I'm just going to share my screen briefly. Just a second. My system works a little bit different at school. So here we are. Okay. So this session is basically a brief introduction to Q methodology, where we'll cover basically how to do a Q method study and what makes it a little bit different from other types of research and other types of studies. And then we'll look briefly at some data and discuss how to analyze it. And I'm sure there will be questions, and I'll be happy to answer any and all questions possible during this session. So basically, Q, in a nutshell, was pioneered in the 1930s by Dr. William Stevenson, and he's basically the founder of Q methodology. And oftentimes, if you go to Q conferences, they're like, well, but Stevenson, when he established the rules, or established this methodology, this is what his thought process was. So it's very interesting to speak with his particular students because they always have very specific answers for different types of questions. And the idea behind Q methodology is that rather than like a typical factor analysis, the individual people, rather than the test items, become the variates. So it's basically an inverted factor analysis where, again, the test items are not the variates, but the people are. And the factors, when they're analyzed, suggest common and empirically grounded structures and relationships between individuals. And Q methodology is designed to elicit factors of subjectivity from the population. So if you're looking at your foundations of research and your structures of different types of research, of course, we have objective research, which is usually a Likert scale or some similar type of thing. And then we have constructivist research, which is typically related to qualitative research. Well, Q methodology is very specifically subjective. So sometimes it receives a lot of criticism, particularly from the objective researcher set, but it is a type of research that elicits, it's designed to elicit subjectivity from the population. There are differences between our research and your factor analysis and Q methodology. And so these are a couple of different ways in which Q is not like R. There is an assumption that in R, there's an assumption that a particular viewpoint exists. So for example, the viewpoint might be, we should get vaccinated for COVID-19. So an R methodology study would look at that particular thought process, that particular idea, and construct their study based on that. So then you can measure, and so we have here the kinds of questions that are asked. What proportion support gun control? So in this case, what proportion of the population supports vaccination from COVID-19? Whereas Q methodology seeks to determine the viewpoints that exist. So Q methodology presents a lot of different ideas, a lot of different thoughts, and analyzes what the variations of opinions are about guns, is what I have on the PowerPoint, but about the COVID-19 vaccination process. So whatever your type of question is, that would be Q methodology looks at the variations of opinion of that particular thing. So in the United States, we have lots of discussions about gun control. So that's why I have that example in there. But COVID-19 vaccinations, I think, is pretty global right now. So how to get started with Q methodology? Well, listening to someone talk about Q methodology and asking them questions, obviously that's a great way to get started. The website qmethod.org, that's the organization website for I4S, which is the International Society for the Scientific Study for Subjectivity. They have a quarterly journal. There's a listserv you can join, and on the listserv, there will often be questions that come up, and you can get answers from all over the world from different Q researchers with particular specific answers to your specific questions. All right, so why in the world would someone use Q? Well, we've already talked about the foundational aspect of it, that it has a subjective approach built in to the way that it's structured. But first of all, you have to think about the purpose of your study. You can obviously say, well, I want to do a Q study, therefore I'm going to structure a Q study, and therefore that's how we're going to proceed. However, researchers should take a look at the questions that they're asking and the purpose of the study that they are embarking upon. And then when they have a research question that is specifically looking for perspectives and specifically looking for various viewpoints of individuals, then Q methodology, using a subjective research methodology, is ideal for that type of a study. So we know that when we want to know the percent of something, when we want to know how many individuals within a population fall into particular categories, we will use an objective study. We know that when we want to look at the experiences of something, of somebody, then we go for a more constructivist study. And then when we're looking for perspectives, we want to go for that subjectivist type of methodology. So that's where Q method comes into play. So once you've decided that you're going to use Q methodology, the first thing you want to do is establish your condition of instruction. So the condition of instruction is the instruction that you will use when your participants sort their Q statements. So, which we'll get to in a little bit, but you'll have these Q statements that participants will sort onto a form board. Again, don't worry, we will know what a form board is by the time we are done here. But your condition of instruction will link to your research question. So for example, one condition of instruction that I used was which of these statements is most like you? I know that seems very broad, but my research question is, what is your experience? What are the perspectives, the self-perspectives and the self-descriptions that adolescents have about their emotionality? So which one is most like you? Another condition of instruction that I've used is, what do you believe about this historical event that we're referencing in our research study? So what is your belief about this particular historical event? And so that leads back to the research question about seeking perspectives on that historical event that we're studying. So in terms of how many instructions, sometimes Q studies only involve one participant, which is really interesting. I personally have never done that, but I do know other people who have. Or I know people who have used two conditions of instruction, and each person that participated in their study sorted the cards 2 times based on different conditions of instruction. For example, if you want to track someone's perception of themselves over a period of time, you might have a condition of instruction. When you were 10 years old, what did you believe about this? When you were 15, what did you believe about this? When you were 20, what did you believe about that? And so in that case, you have a more intensive study, one person with multiple conditions of instruction, as opposed to an extensive study where you have one condition of instruction, everybody gets the same condition of instruction, but you have multiple people that sort that same set of statements. So in order to come up with your statements, you develop a concourse. A concourse is as many statements as possible that relate to that particular topic, that particular thing that you are trying to study, that you are trying to understand or get perspectives from. So there are three basic ways to develop a concourse. The first that's listed there is a naturalistic way to develop a concourse. This is where you read a lot, you interview a lot, you talk to a lot of people, and you gather statements and themes and ideas from the interviews that you do, from the reading that you do, from reading newspaper articles, from capturing statements online. Facebook is particularly great for capturing statements, or this kind of naturalistic type of concourse development where you gather as many perspectives and as many thoughts about a particular topic as possible. So it's good if you interview people, if you have very specific questions that help them to articulate their thoughts and their understanding of a particular event or particular concept. Oftentimes concourse development kind of falls under a qualitative analysis type of approach or perspective, where you are drawing those themes, you're drawing those ideas out in order to develop your concourse. The next is a theoretical approach, very specifically looking at theories that are foundational to the topic or the subject that you are researching and you're trying to understand more specifically. And then taking those the theoretical structure and creating a self-referent list of statements that describe that theoretical structure for the individuals, the participants to sort. And then the third would be a hybrid, which would be a mix of the two. So that would be developing the concourse. So once you have a concourse developed, where you have you could have hundreds of statements, you could have 60 statements, but it's a concourse that is fairly thorough description or covering of that particular topic. And once you have that, you want to narrow it down to, so you don't have repetitive statements, and you don't have, and you have statements that are clear, you have statements that are based in opinion and not in fact. Okay, so let me clarify. They may be based in fact, but they're stated as an opinion based on a particular perspective. If an item is a specific fact, that's not really a great opinion item. So you want your statements to be opinions, because you're gathering viewpoints and not an understanding of fact-based information. All right. Okay, so once you have developed your concourse, then you develop your Q sample or your Q set. So like I said, you narrow it down to items that are not repetitive. They might be similar in category or similar in idea, but you don't want them to just be a simple repeat in just slightly different words. You want it to be clear. You want it to be able to be a representative of the different ideas that you have. For example, if you're looking at a theoretical concourse, say we decided to use the Big Five personality theory. So you have your 5 different aspects of the Big Five personality test. You would take representative statements that describe the different personality types of those Big Five concepts, and use those statements that represent those Big Five as your Q sample, your Q set. So you look at the language of the statements. You consider also your participants. I personally have done a lot of Q studies with individuals under 18, so non-adults, I guess I should say, with children, primary schoolers and secondary school students. And so I've had students in my own class read through the statements to make sure that the wording that I've used isn't going to be too confusing for students that, for individuals that would be sorting the statements. And so I'll just give them the list of statements and say, hey, read through this list of statements and tell me if there are any statements in and of themselves that are kind of confusing to you. And then I can reword those statements so that they get the idea across, but that I know it's going to make sense to my participants, and that while I'm having participants sort the statements, they won't be asking me what different words mean. And the number of statements, usually 40 to 60 suffices. That's pretty average, 40 to 60 statements. Some studies have a lot more, like around 100. That's a little bit overwhelming to participants. My very first Q study I did with young elementary school age kids. They were between the ages of 3 and 6. And I only had 30 items because I felt like that was enough for that age group. But I did get a little bit of criticism that 32 is really the minimum amount of number of statements, simply for validity of the data. But again, I feel like working with that small, I mean, I could have added 2, but working with that young of a group, you have to be cautious about how many items, how many statements you're dealing with, depending upon your population. So, all right, so your P sample is your participants. In Q methodology, they're called the P sample. And we want that particular P sample to be representative of perspectives. So you want to have a wide variety of perspectives. Typically, this involves very purposive sampling. Typically, you're very specifically approaching a particular group of individuals. You might be working with a particular classroom of students, or you might be working with a particular organization to specifically gain as many participants that represent broad perspectives as possible. So ideally, so there's conversation about how many people. 5 per factor is kind of a general tossed around number. So if you have 40 to 60 statements, you really want to have about 30 participants or more. So you want to have 30 participants is a good amount for 40 statements. If you have a few number of statements with lots of participants, then your numbers can get kind of skewed, and you can tend to end up with a one factor solution, which is not what you want, because you want representative perspectives, and not everybody thinks the same way. So they recommend, Q methodology recommends 50 to 80. I've never done one with that many personally. It kind of depends on your study and your population that you have access to, but about 30 is a good number for a broad set of participants. So, and I always use a demographic sheet to aid in the analysis. Typically for a Q study, my demographic sheet is a little broader, and I'll add questions to it, such as, tell me a little bit about the statements that you felt very strongly about. Tell me a little bit about your experiences with this particular topic, and have some different questions in there to help supplement the data, because Q methodology does use both quantitative and qualitative elements in the methodology, in the analysis, in the study. So Q sorting is, all right, Q sorting is when you take the statements and you sort them onto the form board. There are very specific instructions that you want to give your participants. It's much easier if you're there in person, but unfortunately in the days of COVID, most of us have had to go to an online format for Q sorting, and online format is helpful if you're trying to get in, if you're working internationally in particular. So it's nice to have that option, but I do have to say that in person is much easier to do. Just for the sake of example, I'm going to change my screen share and look really quickly at a set of data. So this is a form board. As you can see, this is a factor one of a set of data that I had. But anyway, as you can see, it is arranged in a sort of bell curve type shape, just like you would have, you know, a normal bell curve. And the statements on the far right are the statements that have been identified as the most like, and the statements on the left are the most not like. And then the ones in the middle are the statements that the participants feel neutrally about. And when we go to analyze, our factors, we typically will focus on the factors in the far right and the far left. So when I analyzed this particular study, I started with column +2 to +5, and then column -5 to -2, and kind of left the center 3 columns out, except for quick references here and there as necessary as I went through the analysis process. Oops. Sorry, let me get back to where I was. Okay, so that is the form board. And administration of the form board, basically you give your participants a pile of statements, or if you're online, it'll just be, you know, a list of statements, however your computer program has it structured. They'll divide that into 3 different groups: most like, most unlike, neutral, or feel most positively strongly about, most negatively strongly about, and then neutral in the center. And then you start with the strongest to the right, and the strongest positive to the right, strongest negative to the left, and sort those according to the condition of instruction. So you can, if you fit the demographic that you are looking for in terms of participants, you can add your own sort into the mix, because this is subjective, and adding your own sort does help to inform about your own bias, and you can see which factor you most identify with. In terms of data entry, there are several computer programs out there that can be used. PQ method is what I am personally most familiar with, although it's an older program, so I'm going to have to switch, and CADE is the one that I've been looking at and working with most recently. But KenQ is available. There are some others beyond the ones I have listed here. So you enter the data, the project name, your distribution shape, because the way that I had my form board structured may not be the same as what you would like your form board structured like, and how the distribution is, the participant name, and and I usually enter their name as a code, and their sort. Once you run the data, you'll have a correlation of sorts, which can be described as points in a factor space. Q methodologists tend to look at those points in the factor space in terms of a 3-dimensional perspective, 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional perspective, and will often rotate those points just to extract the particular factors. So I have another example. This is the same study as the form board we saw earlier, but once you run the data, you get this really great factor matrix, and it's super exciting. But once you rotate, you can rotate for however many factors you feel best fits your data. In this particular case, I rotated, and 3 factors based on the 5 people per factor rule was the actual number of factors, but I personally chose to include this 4th factor. So you can see here, this is my code of the individuals that participated, and hopefully you can see this and it's not too tiny, but this is the code of the people who participated, and these are the factors that they loaded onto. So you can see this first person loaded onto factor 1, and second person on factor 3, and the third and fourth person on factor 2. And you can see here on factor 4, I only have 2 individuals that loaded onto factor 4. I kept them, and I can justify keeping them because both of these individuals loaded very high and very pure. As you can see, they barely loaded onto these other factors for either one. And their loads here, their correlations are very high for this particular factor. So because it was such a strong factor with just 2 participants, I can justify the use of that 4th factor because they weren't included on any of the 3 other factors. And they were so strong for that 4th factor. All right. So, all right. So then once you have your factors rotated and once you have determined what your factors will look like, then you can analyze the factor themselves. So when I do my factor analysis, I place from the data printout. So I'm just going to show you really quickly so you know that I came up to this from somewhere. You can see the factor scores for factor 1 and for factor 2. So I have these lists of scores that come from the printout. So from the scores that come from the printout, then I arrange the statements onto the form board so that I can see it. This is how I do it, because to me, I really like this visualization where you can see how closely related different statements are. And then, as I said earlier, I analyze closely and look for similarities and themes within the statements from the far right and the far left. So, all right. So, yes, you arrange it into the different arrays and then you analyze for themes on the far right and the far left. When you look at your validation, because validation is something that is always asked about, you want to look, you can do post-sort interviews of your high pure loaders. So if you remember from the screen I shared with you earlier of the factors, the factor matrix, there were those two that loaded very high and pure on factor 4. If I had been able to, I could have gone back and interviewed those two particular individuals to explain to me a little bit more of their thought process during that, during the sort, and even talk to them about the themes that I've extracted and had them give me a little bit of perspective about those particular themes. Another way to help validate your study is to ensure that you have other individuals read through your analysis and look at your study to as part of a peer review, even an informal peer review type of process. And then the next thing to do is to develop a full text interpretation of each factor array. And of course you do this and it's part of your study, your paper that you write. Then the last thing to do, of course, is to communicate the results. You want to ensure that your results are responding to the particular research question that you're asking, which of course, if you have structured your condition of instruction and your concourse and QSET according to your research question, then of course it should address the research question. And then of course, write your thesis, dissertation, your manuscript for publication. You present either in a poster session or in a paper. And then I have some different resources. These are listed in the PowerPoint, and I know there's a lot there, but these are some different resources. I just want to draw your attention to this. These are this manual, the PQ method manual that's available online. Most of this is accessible, and I think I had on the first, one of the first slides, I think I had the link to a site with several papers on there. So are there any questions at this point in time?
First off, thank you very much. That was really fascinating and a interesting talk. This is a completely new methodology for me personally, so it was great to learn something different and brand new. But yeah, over to anyone else for any questions.
Yeah, I have one. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that presentation. It's always nice to have, like a snapshot of someone explaining what the methodology is about. I want to ask about the issue of grouping the people who are doing the Q sorts. For instance, if you're interested in, say, stakeholder groups, the sorts are done by, say, 2 people per group. Are you, what do you have an experience with this kind of studies, or
Where you have a lot of factors, but only 2 people in each factor?
no? You have many factors. You have many sorters as well. The P set is also big, but you want to group the sorts done by particular participants, if you know what I mean. So for instance, if you have a group of, say, 20 people, and in this, you already know that these are particular interest groups that I targeted, and I have 2 people representing each particular interest group. How would you do the analysis? Is it best to have the 2 sorts? How do you have any experience with this, or you have to just go through the analysis at once and then look at the factors that come out?
I think you could do it a couple of different ways. Obviously, with just 2, you need to sort more than 2 people at a time, right? You'd need to run the data for more than 2 people at a time. So you could look at it a number of different ways. If you wanted to look at just one particular group, you could run the data for one particular group. And then you could run the data for another group. And then you could do a second order analysis if you wanted to, where you compare the groups. You compare the factors from each group.